Hello and welcome to the Sourdough Mamas podcast. I'm Heather Courier, and this is a loaded episode. I think we as bakers are very emotional about our sourdough starters. We put a lot of time and effort into them. Many of us have made them from scratch. If you haven't made yours from scratch, you certainly care for and love it like it's a pet. And we are alive, starters are alive, and we are creating and nurturing this living thing. So people understandably are very attached to their starters, and so they want to know why it's acting a certain way, why it might be doing something that they're not expecting it to do. So a lot of people posting all the time on the Facebook group about their starter. Head on over to Sourdough Mamas on the Facebook group if you haven't joined us there already to join the conversation. And so let's get started just talking about what is a sourdough starter from a scientific perspective. It's made from two ingredients, flour and water, and that's it. But what you don't see are the hidden ingredients that bring the starter to life. So there are millions and millions of wild yeasts and bacteria that digest the flour and turn it into carbon dioxide and lactic acid. You can't see it, but it's happening as soon as you add the water to the flour. So it's a pretty cool process, and the carbon dioxide makes the bubbles in your starter, and the lactic acid makes the sour. So you need both in order to have a successful starter. And the overall process to make a starter is pretty simple. Because we probably have some listeners that are just starting out, I just want to review how to make a starter. Basically, there are a lot of different ways. A lot of different people say that you can do it in many different ways. And this is the way that I have found it works. And I've made half a dozen starters in my years of being in sourdough. So you basically just weigh out 100 grams of warm water. You add 50 grams of white flour, so either all purpose or bread flour, and you add 50 grams of whole wheat flour to that. You stir it up and you leave it uncovered for a few hours on your countertop. And you're leaving it uncovered so that some wild yeasts and bacteria can find their way into that jar. But at a certain point, you're going to want to cover it up so that you don't get a really thick, dry skin on the top. So just cover it loosely with some plastic wrap or with the inner rim of the mason jar lid. Don't seal it and just leave it for a day. The next day around the same time, you're going to take out 25 grams of that starter and put it in a new jar. And then to that 50 grams of starter. Forget the 25. You're going to take out 50 grams of starter. I used to recommend 25 grams and I need to rewire my brain. The last time I did a starter, I did it with 50 grams of starter. So the ratio was a 1 to 2 to 2, and I found it worked so much better. But I'm kind of on autopilot and I'm used to saying 25. So forget all that. Start again. Day 2, you're going to take out 50 grams of starter and you're going to add 100 grams of water to the 50 grams of starter. And you're going to add 50 grams of your white flour and 50 grams of your wheat flour. Stir it all up and you leave that for another day. And then you do the exact same thing on day 3. 50 grams of starter, 100 grams of water, 50 grams of wheat flour, 50 grams of white flour. So this again is a 1 to 2 to 2 ratio, and you're going to do this repeatedly every single day until you see the activity that you want to see. So it's pretty simple to make a sourdough starter, although it can behave in all kinds of different ways, as people have pointed out in emails that I get. I probably get a handful of emails every single week about sourdough starter alone and problems with it. So if you're struggling or you have questions, you are not alone either. And so let's talk about that a little bit. Let's dive into that idea that a sourdough starter can be a little difficult, and why might that be? So what would slow the growth of a starter? Things like adding cold water to your starter when you mix it. A cold environment, I would say probably anything colder than about 67 or 68 degrees Fahrenheit in your kitchen would be a little too cool for your starter. Heavily chlorinated water. This can be a hot topic to talk about. I am a firm believer in using tap water in starter because I have 3 kids under age 5 and I need to keep things very, very easy. So I'm not going to go out and buy bottled water just for my starter. Like, I love you, Goldie, but no, that's not happening. So I use tap water and my tap water is fine. If you know that your tap water is heavily chlorinated, just pour some into a pitcher and let it sit out overnight and use that water. That process lets the chlorine vaporize and kind of burn off. I'm probably using the way wrong words for that process, but basically it eliminates the chlorine in your water and you can use it the next day. If you don't want to do that for whatever reason, then you can always use filtered or bottled water. It's completely up to you, but don't fall into this trap of thinking my tap water is insufficient because it's probably just fine. That's my advice as a busy mom. So heavily chlorinated water is a problem. White flour, using only white flour, you're not going to get very far with a sourdough starter from scratch. It's going to take a long, long time to establish. And here's why. White flours have been stripped of almost all of their nutrition. The next step up from white flours are whole wheat flours, and they are still intact. So they haven't been as heavily processed, and they carry a lot of nutrition on them for your sourdough starter microbes. They're full of wild yeasts and they're full of bacteria, and it's all the stuff that they want. A step above the whole wheat flour is the rye flour, and a rye flour is basically as loaded with nutrition for your sourdough starter as you can get. So if you're building a sourdough starter with only white flour, it's either going to take you 6 months or you're not going to get very far at all. So I recommend doing the whole wheat and white flour mix so you get a mix of both. And also feeding too much. So I don't mean too often, I mean too much. So like I said earlier, I used to feed 25 grams of starter with the 50 grams of white, 50 grams of whole wheat, and 100 grams of water. And I found that that was really slow. And here's why. That ratio is 1 to 4 to 4. So for every 1 part of sourdough starter, there were 4 parts of flour. So there was almost too much food for this starter to work through. It was diluting the strength of the sourdough starter, in other words. And so doing a 1 to 2 to 2, you're providing just enough nutrition and still allowing your starter to maintain enough strength to get through all of that flour. And so what can speed up the growth of a starter? Warm water is a great way to start. A warm environment, so make sure your kitchen is nice and warm. And if it's not, I do have a blog post about this, different ways to keep your sourdough starter warm. And it's really helpful. A lot of people have very cold kitchens in the wintertime. So definitely take a look at that if you are struggling with a cold kitchen and a cold starter. Again, dechlorinated water helps to speed it up, and using wheat or rye flours, also feeding a good ratio. So these are all things that we talked about already, but these are going to speed up the growth of your sourdough starter. I get emails all the time from home bakers about how their starter was doubling in the first few days and then it stopped. And they want to know, what did I do wrong? Is it because I did this? Is it because I did that? Is it dead? Is my sourdough starter dead? No, your starter is not dead. So what's happening with this? This is a super, super common problem. So much so that I have a drafted email response in my email in my inbox. Basically, I can cut and copy this email response because I get it all the time. And I am reassuring people that no, your starter isn't dead. And no, it's not a stupid question because it does seem like it died. What happens is the first day, 2, 3, 4, it's doubling and they see a lot of activity and they get really excited. And then day 4, 5, 6, 7 onwards, it doesn't double anymore. It hardly even rises and it's not acting the way that it was. So what's going on? So what is happening? So the lactobacillus, that's the bacteria that we want. That's the lactic acid bacteria that we need to make sourdough bread. It basically needs time to become the reigning champion in your starter. So what's happening those first few days is there's another bacteria that has inoculated your starter for one reason or another. It could be any variety, and it is not the right type of bacteria that we want. So it's not going to last, obviously, because what happens is it makes your starter rise and then it all dies off. And what you want is the lactobacillus. So all those bad bacteria, I don't want to say bad bacteria. That's kind of implies that they're infectious. It's just not the bacteria that we want in your starter. They will slowly die off and then your lactobacillus will slowly pick up. So if you see this doubling and then all of a sudden it stops, just keep feeding, keep feeding, keep feeding, keep feeding. I say this all the time to people, just keep feeding, have faith, be patient. Remember, you're creating a living, breathing thing out of nothing. And so it does take a little bit of time, and it's okay that it's not doubling anymore. It's just remember that things are balancing themselves out and to just keep feeding. So Now that that topic's covered, I want to talk about real quick um, along the lines of dead starter. I went away on vacation once and I was pretty sure I killed my starter because here's what happened. My husband and I took the kids on vacation, and my brother-in-law was staying at the house watching the dog. And about, I don't know, 5 or 6 days into vacation, I called him and I said, "Oh my gosh, I left my sourdough starter on the counter this entire time. Can you please put it in the fridge?" And my brother-in-law knows how to feed a sourdough starter. He's tried to start his own. He understands the concept. It wasn't that I didn't think he could feed it. It was that I wanted to put eyes on it and see what it looked like and see what it smelled like, because I wanted to see basically if I could feed it, if it was safe to feed, or if I should just throw it away. And so he put it in the fridge. And of course, fermentation still happens in the fridge, but much more slowly. So a few days later, I came home, pulled it out, and it had this like pink layer on the top. I think if you've been making sourdough starter long enough, you know that it can develop liquid on the top, which is called hooch, which is a sign that it's a bit hungry. So you just pour it off or you stir it in if you want a really sour sourdough, and you continue feeding, no big deal. But this was like a thick layer of pink, dark pink in some spots. It smelled awful. I really didn't know what to do with it, so I just left it on the counter for a couple hours while I mulled it over. Then what I ended up doing, I was pretty sure I'd killed it because I thought for sure it was full of mold and it was no good. What I ended up doing is I scraped the top layer off. I took a spoon and I scraped it all off, being careful not to, push it down into the starter underneath. I just scraped off that kind of thick, really yucky top layer. And then from below, I scooped from the middle of the jar and I fed that amount of starter. And after a couple days, sure enough, it came back to life and it's been super strong and active ever since. So I can't speak enough to the resilience of a sourdough starter. You cannot kill a sourdough starter unless one of these three things happens. It's literally a catastrophic event. So you either drop the jar on the floor, and I'm sorry, there's no saving that. There could be glass shards inside the starter. Even if you're pretty sure there's not, you're not ever going to be certain. So if you drop that glass jar on the floor and it breaks, you have to say goodbye and start over. We're going to touch on why you should dry some sourdough starter in just a minute. Another catastrophic event is mold growth. So like I said, I thought mold was running rampant through my starter. It turns out it wasn't. It might have been right on the cusp of it, but it hadn't started yet, so it was still safe. But if you for sure have mold growth in your starter, you're not going to want to use it anymore because you will likely contaminate your new starter as you're feeding with your old moldy starter, and you'll never really get rid of those mold spores, or you might not be sure that they're gone. So, there are some gray areas with this. If you can scrape it all off and be certain, you might be okay. But I always just recommend if you're in doubt, throw it out and you're going to want to reactivate your dried starter. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And finally, last but not least, I hear about this often too. And it's so sad when it happens. People put their starter in the oven with the light on to keep it nice and warm, a nice cozy environment. And along comes their husband or their wife or their son, turns on the oven to preheat it, and your starter gets baked. And everyone's thinking, gee, why do I smell fresh bread baking? And your starter is baked to a crisp in the oven. So this happens often. I'm sorry, your starter is gone. There's no coming back from that. So let's talk super quick about drying your starter. All you have to do is go take your jar of starter, feed it, and then whatever's left in that jar that you fed from, take it and spread it over a silpat or some parchment paper and spread it as thin as you possibly can. Leave it out to dry in a nice warm environment. And if where you live, if it's cold or humid, you might want to put it in the oven on a very, very, very low temperature, and keep a close eye on it, maybe for a couple hours, and just let it dry out completely. So it's going to be dark, and then you'll see as it's drying, it'll become a lighter color. So if you see any dark spots, it's still wet, let it dry completely. Then you're going to basically pick up that starter off the parchment paper and you're going to crumple it into little pieces. and you're going to put it into a jar. It's going to be basically in tiny little pieces, like no bigger than your fingernail. And you're going to put that in a jar, and then that's your dried starter. And you're going to put a lid on it and put it in the pantry somewhere away from light, where you store your regular foods. You don't want to put it in the fridge or the freezer. There's just no need because it's already dried and preserved. So that if there's a catastrophic event like mold or dropping the jar or baking your starter, you can pull that out, and what you do is you basically reactivate it. So it's alive, you just add water to it, let it all get mushy, and then you're going to start feeding it, feeding it, feeding it, and before you know it, it's back to life. So it's basically a magic trick, and you need to do this as insurance, especially if you are quite attached to your starter. If maybe you went through something emotional while you were making your starter, or you have an attachment with somebody in your family, you're going to want that backup. So please go now and dry your starter. That's your homework from this episode. So the Sourdough Mamas have been really busy chatting about their starter problems over on the Facebook group, like I mentioned, and I wanted to highlight some of the questions they're asking and try to answer those. So the first one being, why doesn't my starter have big bubbles? So I recently posted a picture of my sourdough starter pretty close up, and it had nice big bubbles, like really nice rise. It just looked gorgeous. So I took a picture, shared it on Instagram, and it got a lot of positive feedback. But as usual with sourdough, or I'm sorry, with social media posting, a lot of people looked at that and they felt that they were insufficient or that they weren't enough, that their starter wasn't good enough, that the starter didn't have big bubbles. Why didn't their starter have bubbles like mine? It must not be as good. So part of me regrets sharing that photo, and I'm going to touch on social media in a few minutes here. But the reason your starter doesn't have big bubbles, it doesn't actually really matter, because big bubbles in a starter does not indicate anything about the quality of your sourdough starter. And I'm going to say that again for the people in the back. If your sourdough starter does not have big bubbles, it does not mean it's inadequate. It could be super, super strong. It could be able to pass the float test, and it still doesn't have big bubbles, and that's okay. Do you want to know a secret? My sourdough starter actually usually never looks like that. And the reason I took a picture of it was because I woke up one morning and it did look like that. And I thought, geez, that looks beautiful. I'm going to take a picture of that. And again, it's just us showing our best sides on social media. So I feel a bit bad about having fed into that whole farce with social media and, always needing to be the best. I just wanted to share a picture of this beautiful starter, but I realized that I was kind of contributing to the issue that I have such a problem with. And so that's why it doesn't matter if your sourdough starter has big bubbles or not. It really, truly doesn't. Another question that I saw was, what is the difference between starter, leaven, poolish, and biga? And if you've never heard of these things before, don't even worry. But for bread bakers, we've heard these terms before. Starter and leaven are basically the same, but leaven is your middleman between your sourdough bread and your starter. So it's basically a starter, but double, triple size, depending how big of a starter you maintain. Not to get too technical, but a lot of people don't even make a leaven before they make sourdough bread. They just build up their starter to a bigger quantity, and then they use some of that to make their dough. A biga and a poolish are called yeasted pre-ferments. And basically what that means is there's commercial yeast added. Biga contains less water than a poolish, and both are used in bread making. But so it's important to remember that with biga and poolish, they have commercial yeast added. Starter and leaven do not. They're just with wild yeasts. Another question I saw people were asking about is, what do I do with my starter if it fails the float test? And this is a common question as well. And in fact, I've had this happen to me before, and I figured out a way to kind of get around it. So a reason that it would fail the float test is that it's either not ready yet, or that you've missed the window and it's already fallen too much. So let's go with option one to start with. It hasn't risen yet. So what your starter is going to look like on the top is a bit domed. It's going to look like a small hill on the inside of your jar. And that's going to indicate that the force of the starter is still pushing up against the middle of the starter and it's kind of sticking to the edges. So that's why it's lower on the edges than in the middle. And that is going to indicate to you that it's not quite ready yet, that you still have some time. So keep checking back. I would give that starter maybe another hour and try the float test again. And if you still don't get it, try another hour and do the float test again. So that's what I would do in that scenario. That's actually the probably the best of either world. If you wait a little too long in scenario 2, your starter has already fallen. So what do we do with that? Well, if you still want to bake, and when I use the term starter, I also mean leaven. So it could be a little bit confusing, but just so you know, some people only use starter and not leaven. So if you're looking to make bread and your leaven or your starter has already started to fall and it doesn't pass the flow test, then what you can do is just feed it a little bit more, like almost think of it like a snack. So you're going to feed it, depending on the size, you're roughly a tablespoon or 2 of flours and a tablespoon or 2 of water. And you're going to stir it all up and you're going to see that it collapses because you're stirring out all those gas bubbles. And just scrape the sides, put it aside, and you're going to have to wait a couple of hours, maybe even sometimes up to, I don't know, depends on your kitchen again, but maybe 6 or 8 hours. And you can pull it out and do the float test again. So you may get away with being able to do it that day again, but most times it's better just to kind of wait till the next day or till it's more convenient, and then you can try again. And finally, what if I mess up my sourdough starter feeds? I saw that somebody posted that they were feeding too little. They were using too little starter with too much flours. And it's not a big deal if you're doing that and you realize it's not a big deal. It's not dead. It's not going to die. Just make the correction and move on. Stick with that correction when you keep feeding. And that is my advice for that one. Again, sourdough starters are so adaptable. They're very flexible. They're very easygoing. As challenging as they can be, they actually are pretty easygoing. So just keep feeding the corrected amounts and you will be completely fine. And so I wanted to mention a pro tip that I've learned. And that is, I kind of alluded to this in the beginning, but something that can help to kickstart your starter, give it a little boost, and if you want it to have more activity faster. So what you can do is take your starter, give it a good feed, as I indicated before, and then add about a teaspoon of rye flour to it, and then stir that all up and leave it. So that little bit of rye flour is going to act like a nitro boost for your sourdough starter. Some people do make complete rye starters, but I just like to stabilize my starter with the white and the wheat flours because that's what you'll be transitioning to eventually. And you already kind of know what you're working with. But you absolutely can use a sprinkle of rye flour in your feeds for the first few days, or even if you're in the middle, if you're 10 or 14 days in and you're not quite where you want to be, you can put a sprinkle of rye flour in there and just see what happens. And definitely take notes, always take notes of any kind of change that you're making with your starter feeding. And I wanted to go off on a little bit of a tangent here about social media. I started talking about that already, but I wanted you all to know that the breads that you see on social media, they're beautiful. They're not the pinnacle of perfection. They're not what you need to achieve. The idea of perfection is based in your heart. You know what you want in your bread. For example, I personally, and this is an unpopular opinion, but I personally don't like an open crumb sourdough. And that's because I'm very practical, I'm very utilitarian. I like to make sandwiches with my bread. I like to feed my kids with my bread. And so I don't want my condiments dripping through these holes onto my kids' clothes. It does look pretty, but it's just, I don't think it's practical. And that's, again, my unpopular opinion. But so I like a nice tight closed crumb. That is my idea of perfection. And when you post a crumb that's a little bit tighter, you tend to get comments like, how come your crumb isn't more open? How do you get a more open crumb? Or if you see someone post a beautiful loaf of bread and they say, how do I get my crumb more open? It doesn't need to be open unless that's what you truly want your bread to do. You don't need to shoot for this kind of false level of perfection that you might see on social media. So I know I've talked about the Sourdough Mamas Facebook group a lot already, but it really is a wonderful home for home bakers, especially if you're just starting out, because it's really supportive and it's very real. People post their breads as they come out of the oven, what they really look like. So it's kind of the reality. They're asking for feedback, but mostly they're saying, like, look at this amazing loaf of bread that I created, and I'm so proud. And everybody else is saying, you should be proud. That looks incredible. Congratulations. So I know this is a bit of a tangent, but I just think that that pursuit of perfection leads to envy, it leads to jealousy, it leads to discouragement, and then it leads ultimately to quitting. So that's not what I ever want for any of you. I don't ever want you to quit and give up on your sourdough. It's great to share on social media, just don't hold yourself to that standard. And so I'm going to get off my soapbox now and stop talking about social media. But I could talk all day about that. That pretty much wraps up our episode about sourdough starter struggles and challenges. So again, this sourdough starter series is going to continue through the coming months as it's a really popular topic. So keep checking in if you're interested in this. You'll see them sprinkled throughout the episode list. And again, if you haven't, please subscribe to the podcast, the Sourdough Mamas podcast. We would love to have you join and love to have you listen. And thank you so much for being here. Have a wonderful day and happy baking.